You've written an article for the Evening Standard today where you say toppling Theresa May would be a disaster. You dole out a lot of advice to her. Why don't you just pick up the phone to her?
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to speak to her at any point in time about it, actually. But I think what's important at the moment is just to say to people publicly, in a sense, look, right in the middle of this Brexit nightmare, it's not the time to change Prime Minister or have a Conservative Party leadership election, which will be around the issue of Brexit. And even though I've disagreed with her a lot of times over how she's handled Brexit, nonetheless, I think right now to change horses would be wrong. And what I've tried to do in the article is set out, what I think would be a way of getting a proper, deliberative, structured process for pushing Parliament to make a clear decision on Brexit.
Does she ever ring you up to ask your advice on matters?
Well, I think whenever Prime Ministers are talking to former Prime Ministers, it should be kind of kept confidential.
It does actually happen.
Of course, I do talk to her from time to time, and I'm always very happy to talk to her. I mean, I think, when you've done the job, you know how difficult it is. And even if there's a disagreement over an issue as big as this, there's still a residual sympathy for anyone who takes on the responsibility.
Now, we've got the European elections on Thursday, hence your article, but do you regard these as almost a quasi-second referendum?
I think probably for reasons of turnout, it won't reach that. But obviously, it's an indication. And the most important thing that I've been saying to people is vote. I mean, if you care about the issue, go and vote, because after you've voted in these European elections, the MPs will then have their vote. So the question is, what are they... they will be reading the runes of this European election, and it will obviously influence how they then come and vote on Brexit, provided that they get, as I say, a clear, proper set of Brexit options put before them, which is the extraordinary thing, that's just not happened in the last 3 years. I mean, they're really incredible.
Well, they've had lots of options, but they've just rejected all of them.
Yeah, except they've never had the options. You've had roving gangs of backbenchers who've tabled votes on particular aspects, but you've never had what I would call a sort of government-led structured process that says, okay, you can have a hard Brexit, you can have a soft Brexit, you can have a no-deal Brexit, and you could have a deal if you wanted to. Which is it? And keep them voting until they reach a conclusion. But this should be done in what I mean by a structured way is the normal way a government would try and get Parliament to take a big decision on an issue like this is to set it out almost in a sort of white paper format where you've interacted with the people proposing the different options. You can say, this is what they say, this is what their opponents say. You can set it all out so that people understand that the problem with Brexit has been deciding what form of Brexit. And all the way through, I'm afraid, what people have been told, the public's been told, is it's just a bunch of recalcitrant Remona MPs who won't allow Brexit to go through, when actually Parliament's been struggling with an analysis of the consequences of the different forms of Brexit and unable to reach a conclusion.
But isn't it basically Parliament is stuffed full of Remain supporting MPs on both sides, which they do not reflect the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit?
Well, it's true there probably is a majority for Remain amongst the MPs, and the 60 million are of some account at least. But actually, part of the problem that the Prime Minister's had on her deal has come from the other side, the side that supported what I would call, the Brexit at any cost position. And so the opposition's actually come from both parts. And it's come for not stupid reasons. This is my point. In the end, and this is where I have some sympathy for the pro-Brexit MPs when they say, if you're going to do Brexit, do it. I mean, I think this is my view in the end. If you're going to do it, do it. This is why I've always opposed the idea you kind of do a halfway house, what is described as a halfway house.
You're kind of almost arguing for no deal there, or that you would accept in the end, if it comes to it, and whoever takes over from Theresa May goes for no deal, you're saying as if you would accept that.
No, I wouldn't accept no deal.
Well, that is Brexit. That is full Brexit, isn't it?
Full Brexit is a hard Brexit. You see, again, this is why it's so important to set out these options properly. You can negotiate with Europe perfectly easily a Canada-style free trade agreement. That's what I call a hard Brexit. It's taking us out of the single market and the customs union. Obviously, I believe that would be economically painful, but you could do that. And it's then concluding what's called a standard third country agreement with the European Union, as Canada has just done. That's got a lot of economic consequences, but it's not a no-deal Brexit.
But you could, just to be clear, you could accept that. If say in the European elections, the Brexit supporting parties get well over 50%, which looks likely from the polls, that the people will have spoken. UKIP's slogan is "Tell them again," which I think is one of the best slogans ever in political advertising. You could consider a situation where you would have to accept that.
No, I would obviously be arguing strongly against it, and I think the only thing that would provide real validity now, because I don't think you'll get the turnout that you had in the last referendum, is a referendum. But if, for example, the people voted again to leave in a further referendum, I think they would obviously be voting for a hard Brexit. A no-deal Brexit would only come into being in these circumstances, though this is a risk if you had a new Tory leadership. A no-deal Brexit would come about in circumstances where those arguing for a hard Brexit continue to try to argue what Theresa May has unsuccessfully argued for 3 years, which is that Europe should let us have access to the benefits of the single market without keeping to its rules. That is never going to work. It wouldn't work for her. It wouldn't work for any other leader. It wouldn't work for Boris Johnson. It wouldn't work for Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, since Labour's policy's been somewhat the same. There's no way that is ever going to work. So your only risk is if you got a Tory leader that was fighting for a hard Brexit on completely unrealistic terms, then you might end up with no deal.
But if there were a second
I wouldn't ever vote for that.
Okay, if there were a second referendum, though, you accept that it can't just be Remain versus Theresa May's deal. There has to be a Brexity alternative to that on the ballot paper. You do accept that?
Yeah, I do accept that.
Emily Thornbury, when I interviewed her, she did not accept that.
But you've got to be realistic about this. The Brexit side won the last referendum. Now, I happen to believe after this mess and with a decision of this magnitude, it's justified to go back to the people. But you can't exclude the option that most people who support Brexit want. I mean, I don't know that there's a majority in the country for this, because I don't think it's entirely clear, exactly what form of Brexit was mandated in June 2016. But I think you have to say, looking at the polling and talking to people, that the majority of people who want Brexit want what you would call full Brexit. Now, where I criticise them is I think they're not prepared to be frank with people about the economic consequences. So in our service industry, for example, where we've got a whacking great surplus, Britain with the rest of Europe, it will severely curtail our ability to function in those markets in the way that we have. I think it could also cause us problems with the goods side of trade, and it will certainly cause us big problems in Northern Ireland. On the other hand, it is possible to do it. I mean, it's not, the country can negotiate this and you end up with a completely different relationship with Europe. It will take transition to do that, but you could do it.
Now, anecdotally, quite a few Remainers are saying that they're actually going to vote for the Brexit Party on Thursday, which you might think, well, why on earth would they do that? They say it's not because they've changed their mind. I know, I can see where you think.
Okay, explain that one to me.
They say they haven't changed their minds, but they think democracy has to be delivered on. Now, if those Remainers can respect democracy, they will ask, well, why can't you?
Yeah, so my answer to that is I do respect the decision in June 2016. But I think you've got to be very clear about this. In June 2016, we knew the house we were leaving. We hadn't yet seen the new house that we're moving to. And I think it's, as a matter of principle, perfectly acceptable to say once we see the negotiated outcome with Europe, we're entitled to decide whether we still want to proceed or not. And you can say, well, tell them again. I can say, well, think again. And, that is, I think, a perfectly reasonable position.
But isn't that the problem here, that people have thought again? And yes, there has been a marginal shift in the opinion polls to Remain. Perfectly happy to accept that. But not enough to warrant another vote. Because if you think about it, the week before the referendum, all the polls showed that Remain was going to win. So there's a lot of shy Brexiteers out there, which I suspect there still are. If there had been a shift to 65, 70% Remain, even I would argue that there probably ought to be another referendum, but that shift hasn't taken place, has it?
No, I think that's true. But on the other hand, I think it's just such a huge decision. Maybe if the negotiation had turned out to be a roaring success and, you'd had a pretty easy outcome and Parliament had passed it, you might say, well, come on, there's no point in going back to the people. But I just think this is a decision of, this is a destiny-changing decision for the country, right? So I think, given the mess and given the magnitude, I don't think it's unreasonable. And, if you test it in this way, supposing when David Cameron had first proposed the referendum, he'd said, look, we're going to have a referendum. And by the way, this often happens with referenda. We're going to have a referendum, we're going to have a negotiation. At the conclusion of that, we'll have a final say referendum. I think most people, that would have passed Parliament. Now, we didn't do it, but it's not such an inherently unreasonable proposition. And I would argue, just as there's a perfectly reasonable point to say, well, you can't point to some seismic shift in opinion polls. But I think what you can point to is that this thing has turned out to be infinitely more complicated than anyone thought. And therefore, isn't it sensible, actually, to ask people whether they want to tell us again or think again?
Are you the right messenger for this message? Somebody who is a friend of mine, great Remainer, somebody you actually know, said that, asked me to ask you this, said, you and Alistair Campbell were masters of communication. Why don't you realise that no matter how strong or powerful your argument is on Brexit, the message carrier is killing it because people are still furious about Iraq? Do you buy that?
Some people feel like that and other people don't feel like that. And this is an issue that is such importance to me, and I feel so passionately about it, that I'm not, I stayed quiet during the referendum campaign pretty much, apart from the...
Was it for that reason?
Yeah, partly, because people said, we don't need you in the mix. Fine, but not at this moment.
How did that make you feel when someone said that to you? Because you were Prime Minister for 10 years, you were hugely popular, and yet someone comes to you and says, actually, Tony, we'd be really grateful if you didn't get involved in this. Yeah,
but this is politics. And by the way, one of the things you learn about politics is that if you're afraid of controversy or criticism, don't go into it. And so, I completely understand that, and Iraq's a different argument, and I'm very happy to have it with people. But if they want not to listen as a result of that, fine. I don't find that's as much as people say it. And
because that's interesting, because when I said I was going to do this interview with you, I don't know if you look at Twitter, you probably don't, and that may be just as well. But I mean, it was just, well, why? It's war criminal, all that. Yeah. But do you get that from ordinary people in the street when you meet them?
Not really, but that may be just because they're being polite. But you can't. There's nobody you're going to interview that's been a big figure in British politics that isn't going to come with their detractors. And one of the things that's really important about social media nowadays is that politicians don't get, buffeted by it. In fact, it's one of the paradoxes of modern politics, which is that in an era of social media, conventional politicians get blown up around by these waves of emotion on social media. But the paradox is at the same time that's happening to them, the public actually wants leaders who stand up. And there's no one is ever going to be in government taking difficult decisions and not getting criticism for it. But in social media, the criticism tends to be an exchange of abuse often, not an exchange of argument. And it's important to stand out against that, and also to realize one of the first lessons in leadership in politics is to understand that those that shout loudest don't necessarily deserve to be heard most. And I'm not, on this issue, I feel so strongly, I'm not going to have someone tell me I can't speak. When people have done that, I've said to them, look, here's how democracy works. I can't force you to listen, and you can't stop me speaking. So this is an issue of such importance that people want to listen, they can listen. If they don't, that's fine.
Shukra Moona said yesterday he wants Article 50 revoked without a referendum because he doesn't think there's time to get anything through before October. Is that something you would contemplate?
I think it's pretty difficult to do that, really. I mean, look, this is a part of the trouble with this whole business of Brexit is that politicians, once Brexit's happened, politicians have looked for a compromise over Brexit. And I've actually come to the conclusion there isn't a Brexit compromise. The only one that's been offered, which is that we stay part of the customs union or we have a Norway type arrangement, a single market. What's the point of doing a Brexit that the Brexit people say isn't Brexit?
You're sounding a bit Brexity today.
No, I'm not sounding Brexity. I'm sounding, here are the actual choices. What is...
Well, given the realistic choices and rule out the ones that aren't realistic, what do you think should happen then?
Well, the choices between staying, in my view, hopefully in a reforming Europe, but staying, or hard Brexit, those are the realistic choices. I think Parliament might be tempted to go for a soft Brexit. But I think the moment they do that, you'll have people saying, well, what's the point? From both sides of the argument. I mean, literally, what would be absolutely bizarre is to end up in the same relationship to Europe as Norway. So in the interest of taking back control, in inverted commas, you've ended up losing the seat at the table, which is the control you have. And I think a much better argument for us is to go just to the heart of the whole Brexit debate, because Brexit is based on a myth, ultimately, which is that we don't control our own laws when we do. I mean, we decide what happens with the health service or our education system or taxes or spending. We decide it here in the UK. And the real weakness of the Farage and Boris Johnson case is that they are driven because they try to justify this in terms of this is, we need to become a sovereign nation again, when we obviously are a sovereign nation. And therefore they're driven to attacking the single market because that is where we agree to pool our laws with others in order to make trade easier. And they're therefore driven to giving these examples of why we don't have sovereignty that to most normal people would seem completely bizarre in terms of what matters in their lives. And therefore, in my view, in the end, the best thing is not to try and reach a compromise over the form of Brexit, but to accept there's just a fundamental disagreement and instead to agree a process that people think would be fair.
A lot of Labour supporters are wrestling with their consciences about what to do on Thursday, particularly those who are very pro-European. I do a podcast every week with Jackie Smith, your former chief whip.
Right.
And she's openly admitted that she doesn't know what she's going to do, which for somebody who was a chief whip is quite something. What's your advice to her? Should she take Margaret Hodges' advice and vote for a pro-European party?
Well, I've said I'm voting Labour and I will, but...
So you're putting party over country?
I'm not putting party over country.
You are, because you think this is such an important issue for this country,
right.
And yet you're still going to vote for a party that effectively wants to deliver Brexit.
Yeah, but I don't think it really does. I mean,
the leadership does.
I completely agree that the Labour Party's position on this has been at points indescribably hopeless. Don't misunderstand me. And the leadership's position, I don't know. But if you're talking about the Labour Party as a whole, I still think the people who are voting Labour on the whole want to remain.
Even Alistair Campbell this morning said on the Jeremy Vine show that he doesn't think he's going to vote Labour.
So I completely agree. When I've been saying
but you definitely are.
Even
for 100%, you are definitely going to vote Labour.
Well, you can either do it 100% or no percent because there's only one vote. But no, I have voted Labour. I will vote Labour.
Right.
Yeah, but what I've also said, and I say this again now, is that I'm not criticising if Jackie or even Alistair come to a different point of view, then they come to a different point of view.
And you're going to say, this is a hypothetical question, but you've got to answer it. You have a choice, 10 years of a Labour government and Brexit, or 10 years of a Tory government and no Brexit.
And I have to make that choice.
You have to make that choice. You're not,
because you've asked
I won't
me.
let you out of the room unless you do.
Well, we could be here a long time. I think it's possible to get a sensible Labour government and no Brexit, but although I agree that both are looking a little remote at the moment.
I want to show you a picture that I've just had just before we came on air, and it's of Nigel Farage being milkshaked. What's your comment on that?
Horrible and ridiculous, and people shouldn't do it.
Because
I can't stand this. I mean, I really feel very strongly about this. The guy's entitled to his point of view. I don't agree with them. I profoundly disagree with them. We've got to get out of this situation where if you disagree with someone, you can stop them speaking, you can disrupt their meetings, you can throw things over them. It's ridiculous.
Do you admire Nigel Farage?
I think he's an effective communicator, so I admire that bit of him. But
because he's been described as the most effective or influential British politician since you.
Okay, well that will be, yeah.
Would you debate him one-on-one before Thursday?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Be quite something, though.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting. We'll see. There may be another occasion at another time.
Change UK.
But this thing about, I just want to dwell on this thing for a moment, because we've got to get out of conducting politics like this. And when an event like that happens, I know it's very difficult for the media, but it's not going to dominate the entire coverage of the individual or the day. It's interesting, I was reading I was reading a speech that actually Churchill gave in the early part of last century, and when they used to do these proper big meetings, you know, with people who would come out and, you know, it wouldn't be an audience of people, everyone agreed with everyone. On the contrary, they would be heckling from the audience and it would be a, you know, lively exchange. But what's interesting is the way they reported it is that they had his top line, what he was saying, and then they had underneath that the criticism, and then they had underneath that the response. But it wasn't reported just as like these people were shouting him down in a meeting. And it's just, we've got to get to a quality of discourse where people who disrupt, shout, bawl, scream, try and refuse people platforms to speak, where those people don't take the news. Because the more they take the news, the more they do it.
Change UK, how disappointed are you in their performance and Chuka Umunna? Because you apparently had lots of meetings with Chuka Umunna before they started, and you presumably, from that point of view, wished them well.
I didn't have lots of meetings with Chuka, and in fact, I didn't actually know they were going to do it at the time they did it. No, I mean, I've been talking with them and with the others a lot about politics, and you know, I agree obviously with a lot of what they're saying about the state of British politics today. I think they've got to be, you know, themselves, they're finding how difficult politics is. That's fine. They've just got to be robust about it.
But they're finished, aren't they?
No,
they've had a disaster of a campaign.
Yeah, but I don't think you can say that. If their position is essentially correct in its ideas, then I think they will find a place ultimately in the political firmament. But I'm not sure exactly what. And you know, I think politics is in a unique state of unpredictability, frankly, at the moment.
Talking of which, Tory party leadership, what's the one word that comes into your mind when I say Boris?
That's what comes into mind.
Nothing. Because you have said that you think that a Boris Johnson-led Tory party would beat a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour party.
Well, I think the problem is that if you put a populist right up against a populist left, then my general experience of politics is the populist right wins.
And you regard Boris Johnson as a populist? In the sense that we use that word nowadays?
I do, actually. I mean, I think that is where he comes out. But, you know, again, the most important thing will be to defeat the ideas. And, you know, I think if he takes over the Tory party, you know, it will at one level enthuse a lot of Tory supporters at the grassroots and probably those people who are presently inclined to support Brexit party. But at the same time, I think there will be a lot of people in the middle ground with the Tory party who will be put off by it.
You're 65 now, just the age when in America people start...
I have to correct you, I'm afraid.
Oh, what are you?
I had a recent birthday, so it's worse.
Oh, is it? Thank goodness it wasn't that. It was that way around.
Yeah, no, I'm actually 45.
You're at the age now where in America people think about sort of standing for president. Do you think that you've got sort of one big job left in you to do?
No, I know. I mean, I'm getting on with what I'm doing at this institute here, which is obviously, you know, we've got almost 300 people employed in it. We work in many different countries in the world. I'm very enthusiastic about the work we're doing. Not that it really gets much publicity back here, but it does do good work around the world. And I don't have any, although I'm much more motivated around British politics than I've been for ages. I've got no, you know, your Twitter followers will be pleased to know no plans to return.
And who's been your biggest, toughest adversary in politics in your political career, apart from Gordon Brown?
Well, they were tough in different ways, the Tory leaders I had. I mean, I always thought we were lucky to be facing John Major when the Tory party was disintegrating, because I actually think otherwise he would have been, I think as a political character, he's quite formidable. William Hay was a brilliant debater, of course. You know, Michael Howard was tough, and actually IDS was tough. Did I miss out any? Oh, David Cameron, yeah. No, I had a lot of them, actually. There were a lot of them, now I come to think of it.
Final question, because I'm getting stared at. You left office 11 years ago. In retrospect, do you think you went too early?
Almost 12. No, I don't think that. I sometimes think maybe I got the office too early, because the interesting thing about going out in the world since I left in 2007, that's now almost 12 years.
It is, yeah.
I've learned so much. I mean, I'm both encouraged and slightly appalled by the amount I've learned. And one of the things I think that's a real problem in politics today is that, you know, your real life experience as a politician, you know, when you start early is limited. And
so you actually think you'd be a better Prime Minister if you actually got the office now, maybe?
whether I'd be better or not, I'd be certainly a lot more
Wiser.
Well, wiser and more knowledgeable about the world, maybe, for sure, more knowledgeable about the world. And it's just fascinating how fast it's changing. And I think the biggest challenge that's going to come to all politicians over the next few years is this technological revolution. I think it's going to change everything. I mean, we're part of this technology revolution here. And it's going to transform every single walk of life. And I don't think we're prepared for it. And I don't think the policymakers really understand the change makers. And this is a big challenge.
Tony Blair, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian.